A good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for tuning in to this broadcast, although it probably won't be live when you tune into this. Um, Today we will be continuing Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, chapters 10 till 12. I didn't really stream much recently because I was reading The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's a really good book, I think. The family conflict is very well worked out and characters are very well developed. Also, the way Dostoevsky sometimes just switches to political commentary or commentary on the role of religion in society is very interesting, in my opinion. So, yeah, that's something I wanted to say about The Brothers Karamazov. I haven't finished it yet, so um, no spoilers, I guess. Well, without further ado, let's get into this. Chapter 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all the Bloomsbury Centre's 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director was fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing, spermatozoa were burrowing head first into eggs and fertilized. The eggs were expanding, dividing, or if bokonoskified, budding and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination rooms, the escalators went rumbling down into the basement, and there, in the crimson darkness, stewingly warm on the cushion of peritoneum and gorged with blood surrogate and hormones, the fetuses grew and grew, or, poisoned, languished into a stunted epsilon hood. With a faint hum and rattle, the moving wrecks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks and the recapitulated eons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamo spurred into the sub-basement. The lifts rushed up and down. On all the 7 floors of nurseries it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labeled infants were simultaneously sucking down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in 10 successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon sleep were as busy as everyone else, though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypnopedic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness and the thoughtless love life. Above these again were the playrooms where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modeling, Hunt the Zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz, the hive was humming. Buzzily, joyfully, blithe was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinators whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room what glorious jokes were cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying. In this room, because it contains more high-caste workers than any other in the center, I have told him to meet me here at 2:30. He does his work very well, put in Henry, with hypocritical generosity. I know, but that's all the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behavior. Murder kills only the individual. And, after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. Ah, but here he comes. Bernard had entered the room and was advancing between the rows of fertilizers towards them. A veneer of jaunty self-confidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud. That in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft. A squeak. "Yes, Mr. Marks," said the director portentously. "I did ask you to come here to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand." "Yes," Bernard answered. "Yes," repeated the director, lingering, a serpent on the S. Then, suddenly raising his voice, "Ladies and gentlemen," he trumpeted. "Ladies and gentlemen." The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists, suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked round. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director repeated once more. "Excuse me for thus interrupting your labors. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger. Ladies and gentlemen, this man," he pointed accusingly at Bernard, "this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus to whom so much has been given, and for whom, in consequence, so much must be expected, this colleague of ours, or should I anticipate as say this, ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him, by his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of our thought and behave out of office hours, even as a little infant." Here the director made the sign of the T. "He has proved himself an enemy of society, a subverter. Ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason I propose to dismiss him with ignominy, from the post he has held in this center. I propose forthwith to apply for this transference to a sub-center of the lowest order, and that his punishment may serve the best interest of society, as far as possible removed from any important center of population. In Iceland, he will have a small opportunity to lead others astray by his unthoughtless example." The director paused, then folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. "Marx," he said, "can you show any reason why I should not now execute the judgment passed upon you?" "Yes, I can," Bernard answered in a very loud voice, somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. "Then show it," said the director. "Certainly, but it's in the passage." "One moment." Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. "Come in," he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset 2 test tubes full of spermatozoa. Bloated, sagging in among those firm youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness, Linda was advancing into the room, coquettishly smiling her broken and discolored smile, and rolling as she walked, or what she meant to be a voluptuous undulation, her enormous haunches. Bernard walked beside her. "There he is," he said, pointing at the director. "Did you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked indignantly. Then, turning to the director, "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere, among 1,000, but perhaps you have forgotten me. Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him. her head on one side, still smiling, but with a smile that became progressively, in the face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident. That wavered and finally went out. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The bloodshot and sagging face twisted grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. "Tomakin!" She held out her arms. Someone began to titter. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this monstrous—" "Tomakin!" She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms round his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. "This monstrous practical joke," the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately she clung. "But I'm Linda! I'm Linda!" The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby," she screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her horrified. "Yes, a baby, and I was its mother." She flung the obscenity in like a challenge into the outraged silence, then suddenly breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing, "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin, because I always did my drill, didn't I? Didn't I? Always. I don't know how, if you knew how awful, Tomakin, but he was a comfort to me all the same." Turning towards the door. "John," she called. "John!" He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked round, then soft on his moccasined feet, strode quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director and said in a clear voice, "My father." The word for Tomakin was not so much obscene as with its connotations of something at one remove from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, a scatological rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable tension. Laughter broke out, become enormous, almost hysterical, peal after peal, as though it would never stop. My father, and it was the director. My father. Oh, Ford, that was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration. Tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. My father. Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in an agony of bewildered humiliation. My father. The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more soundly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper-caste London was wild to see this delicious creature, who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatcheries and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the centre again, had flopped down and called him, the joke was almost too good to be true, my father. Linda, on the contrary, cut no eyes. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, that was past a joke. It was an obscenity. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage, had been hatched out of a bottle and conditioned like anyone else, so couldn't have really quiet ideas. Finally, and this wasn't by far the strongest reason for people not wanting to see poor Linda, there was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth, with bad teeth and a blotched complexion, and that figure. Ford, you simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Yes, positively sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda, and Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was for her the return to Soma, was the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday, without ever having to come back to a headache or a fit of vomiting, without ever being made to feel always as you always felt after periodal, as though you'd done something so shamefully antisocial that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect, and, if the morning after was disagreeable, it was so, not intrinsically, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The remedy was to make the holiday continuous. Greedily she clamored for ever larger, ever more frequent doses. Dr. Shaw first demurred, then let her have what she wanted. She took as much as 20 grams a day, which will finish her off in a month or two, the doctor confided to Bernard. One day the respiratory center will be paralyzed, no more breathing, finished. And a good thing too. If we couldn't rejuvenate, of course it would be different. But we can't. Surprisingly, as everyone thought, for one Soma holiday Linda was most conveniently out of the way, John raised objections. But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much? In one sense, yes, Dr. Shaw admitted, but in another we're actually lengthening it. The young man stared, uncomprehending. Soma may make you lose a few years in time, the doctor went on, but think of the enormous, immeasurable durations it can give you out of time. Every Soma holiday is a bit of what our ancestors used to call eternity. John began to understand. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, he murmured. Eh? Nothing. Of course, Dr. Shaw went on. You can't allow people to go popping off into eternity if they got any serious work to do. But as she hasn't got any serious work, all the same, John persisted, I don't believe it's right. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Well, of course, if you prefer to have her screaming mad all the time. In the end, John was forced to give in. Linda got her Soma. Thenceforward, she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house, in bed, with the radio and television always on, and the patchouli tap just dripping, and the Soma tablets within reach of her hand. There she remained, and yet wasn't there at all, was all the time away, infinitely far away, on holiday in some other world, where the music of the radio was a labyrinth of sonorous colors, a sliding, palpitating labyrinth that led, by what beautifully inevitable windings, to a bright center of absolute conviction, where the dancing images of the television box were the performers in some indescribable, delicious, all-singing feeling, where the dripping patchouli was more than scent, was the sun, was a million saxophones, was Popeye making love, only much more so, incomparably more, and without end. No, we can't rejuvenate, but I'm very glad, Dr. Shaw had concluded, to have had this opportunity to see an example of senility in a human being. Thank you so much for calling me in. He shook Bernard warmly by the hand. It was John, then, they were all after, and it was only through Bernard, his accredited guardian, that John could be seen. Bernard now found himself, for the first time in his life, treated not merely normal, but as a person of outstanding importance. There was no more talk of the alcohol in his blood surrogate, no jibes at his personal appearance. Henry Foster went out of his way to be friendly. Benito Hoover made him a present of 6 packets of sex hormone chewing gum. The assistant predestinator came out and catched, almost abjectly, for an invitation to one of Bernard's evening parties. As for the women, Bernard had only to hint at the possibility of an invitation, and he could have whichever one of them he liked. Bernard asked me to meet the savage next Wednesday, Fanny announced triumphantly. "I am so glad," said Lenina. "And now you must admit that you were wrong about Bernard. Don't you think he's really rather sweet?" Fanny nodded, and I must say, she said, I was quite agreeably surprised. The chief bottler, the director of predestination, 3 deputy assistant fertilizer generals, the professor of Feelies in the College of Emotional Engineering, the dean of the Westminster Community Singery, the supervisor of Bokanovskification. The list of Bernard's notabilities was interminable. "And I had 6 girls last week," he confided to Helmholtz Watson. "1 on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 2 more on Friday, and 1 on Saturday. And if I'd had the time or the inclination, then at least a dozen more were all too anxious." Helmholtz listened to his boastings in a silence so gloomily disapproving that Bernard was offended. "You're envious," he said. Helmholtz shook his head. "I'm rather sad, that's all," he answered. Bernard went off in a huff. Never, he told himself, never would he speak to Helmholtz again. The days passed. Success went fizzily to Bernard's head, and in the process completely reconciled him, as any good intoxicant should do, to a world which, up until then, he had found very unsatisfactory. In so far as it recognized him as important, the order of things was good, but reconciled by his success, he yet refused to forego the privilege of criticizing this order, for the act of criticizing heightened his sense of importance, made him feel larger. Moreover, he made him feel larger. Moreover, he did genuinely believe that there were things to criticize. At the same time, he genuinely liked being a success and having all the girls he wanted. Before those who now, for the sake of the savage, paid their court to him, Bernard would parade a carping unorthodoxy. He was politely listened to, but behind his back people shook their heads. "That young man will come to a bad end," they said, prophesying the more confidently in that they themselves would in due course personally see to it that the end was bad. "He won't find another savage to help him out a second time," they said. Meanwhile, however, there was the first savage. They were polite, and because they were polite, Bernard felt positively gigantic, and at the same time light with elation, lighter than air. "Lighter than air," said Bernard, pointing upwards. "Like a pearl in the sky, high, high above them. The weather department's captive balloon shone rosily in the sunshine. The said savage, so ran Bernard's instructions, to be shown civilized life in all its aspects. He was being shown a bird's-eye view of it at present, a bird's-eye view from the platform of the Charing Tea Tower. The station master and the resident meteorologists were acting as guides, but it was Bernard who did most of the talking. Intoxicated, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller. Lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers alighted. 8 identical Dravidian twins in khaki looked out of the 8 portals of the cabin, the stewards. 1,250 kilometers an hour, said the station master impressively. What do you think of that, Mr. Savage? John thought it very nice. Still, he said, Ariel could put a girdle round the earth in 40 minutes. The Savage, wrote Bernard in his report to Mustapha Mond, shows surprisingly little astonishment at or awe of civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda. Mustapha Mond frowned. Does the fool think I'm too squeamish to see the word written out at full length? Partly on his interests being focused on what he calls the soul, which he persists in regarding as an entity independent of the physical environment, whereas, as I try to point out to him, The controller skipped the next sentences and was just about to turn the page in search of something more interestingly concrete, when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. "Though I must admit," he read, "that I agree with the savage in finding civilized infantility too easy, or as he put it, not expensive enough. And I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your ship's attention to—" Mustafa Mond's anger gave place almost at once to mirth. The idea of this creature solemnly lecturing him, about the social order was really too grotesque. The man must have gone mad. I ought to give him a lesson, he said to himself, then threw back his head and laughed aloud. For the moment, at any rate, the lesson would not be given. It was a small factory of lightning sets of 4 helicopters, a branch of the Electrical Equipment Corporation. They were met on the roof itself, for the circular letter of recommendation from the controller was magical in its effects, by the chief technician and the human element manager. They walked downstairs into the factory. Each process, explained the human element manager, is carried out so far as possible by a single Bokanovsky group, and in effect, 83 almost noseless black branchicephalic deltas were cold pressing. The 56 4-spindle chucking and turning machines were being manipulated by 56 aquiline and ginger gammas. 107 heat-conditioned epsilon Senegalese were working in the foundry. 33 delta females, long-headed, sandy with narrow pelvises, and all within 20 millimeters of 1 meter 69 centimeters tall, were cutting screws. In the assembling room, the dynamos were being put together by 2 sets of Gamma Plus dwarfs. The 2 low work tables faced one another. Between them crawled the conveyor with its load of separate parts. 47 blonde heads were confronted by 47 brown ones. 47 snubs by 47 hooks. 47 receding by 47 prognathous chins. The completed mechanisms were inspected by 18 identical curly auburn girls in gamma green, packed in crates by 34 short-legged left-handed male delta minuses, and loaded into the waiting trucks and lorries by 63 blue-eyed flaxen and freckled epsilon semi-morons. O brave new world! By some malice of his memory, the savage found himself repeating Miranda's words. O brave new world that has such people in it. And I assure you, the human element manager concluded, as they left the factory, we hardly ever have any trouble with our workers. We always find... But the savage had suddenly broken away from his companions and was violently retching behind a clump of laurels as though the solid earth had been a helicopter in an air pocket. The savage, wrote Bernard, refuses to take Soma, and seems much distressed because the woman Linda, his, remains permanently on holiday. It is worthy of note that in spite of his senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify and even run counter to natural impulses. In this case, the impulse to recoil from an unpleasant object. At Yvonne, they alighted on the roof of upper school, on the opposite side of schoolyard. The 52 stories of Lupton Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. College on their left, and on their right, the school community singery reared their venerable piles of ferro-concrete and vita glass. In the center of the quadrangle stood the quiet old chrome steel statue of our fort. Dr. Gaffney, the provost, and Miss Keith, the headmistress, received them as they stepped out of the plane. "Do you have many twins here?" the savage asked rather apprehensively, as they set out on their tour of inspection. Oh no, the provost answered. Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. 1 egg, 1 adult. It makes education more difficult, of course, but as they'll be called upon to take responsibilities and deal with unexpected emergencies, it can't be helped. He sighed. Unexpected emergence. He sighed. Bernard, meanwhile, had taken a strong fancy to Miss Keefe. If you're free any morning, Monday, Wednesday or Friday evening, he was saying, jerking his thumb towards the savage. He's curious, you know, Bernard added. Quaint. Miss Keith smiled, and her smile was really charming, he thought. Said thank you. Would be delighted to come to one of his parties. The provost opened the door. 5 minutes in that Alpha Double Plus classroom left John a trifle bewildered. What is elementary relativity? He whispered to Bernard. Bernard tried to explain, then thought better of it and suggested that they should go to some other classroom. From behind the door in the corridor leading to the Beta Minus Geography room, a ringing soprano voice called 1, 2, 3, 4, and then, with a weary impatience, as you were. Malthusian drill, explained the headmistress. Most of our girls are free martins. Of course, I'm a free martin myself, she smiled at Bernard, but we have about 800 unsterilized ones who need constant drilling. In the Beta Minus Geography room, John learned that a savage reservation is a place which, owing to unfavorable climatic or geological conditions, or poverty of natural resources, has not been worth the expense of civilizing. A click. The room was darkened, and suddenly on the screen, above the master's head, there were the penitentes of a coma, prostrating themselves before Our Lady, and wailing as John had heard them wail, confessing their sins before Jesus on the cross, before the eagle image of Pukong. The young Etonians fairly shouted with laughter. Still wailing, the penitentes rose to their feet, stripped off their upper garments, and, with knotted whips, began to beat themselves, blow after blow. Redoubled, the laughter drowned even the amplified record of their groans. But why do they laugh? Asked the savage in a pained bewilderment. Why? The provost turned towards him in a still broadly grinning face. Why? But because it's so extraordinarily funny. In the cinematographic twilight, Bernard risked a gesture which, in the past, even in total darkness, would hardly have emboldened him to make. Strong in his new importance, he put his arm around the headmistress's waist. It yielded willowily. He was just about to snatch a kiss or two, and perhaps a gentle pinch, when his shutters clicked open again. Perhaps we had better go on, said Miss Keefe, and moved towards the door. And this, said the provost a moment later, is Hypnotic control room. Hundreds of synthetic music boxes, one for each dormitory, stood arranged in shelves around 3 sides of the room. Pigeonholed on the 4th were the paper soundtrack rolls on which the various hypnopedic lessons were printed. You slip the roll in here, explained Bernard, interrupting Dr. Gaffney. Press down this switch. No, that one, corrected the provost, annoyed. That one, then. The roll unwinds. The selenium cells transform the light impulses into sound waves, and there you are, Dr. Gaffney concluded. Do they read Shakespeare? Asked the savage as they walked on their way to the biochemical laboratories past the school library. Certainly not, said the headmistress, blushing. Our library, said Dr. Gaffney, contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements. 5 busloads of boys and girls, singing or in a silent embracement, rolled past them over the vitrified highway. Just returned, explained Dr. Gaffney, while Bernard whispering, made an appointment with the headmistress for that very evening. From the slow crematorium, death conditioning begins at 18 months. Every tot spends 2 mornings a week in a hospital for the dying. All the best toys are kept there. And they get chocolate cream on Death's Day. They learn to take dying as a matter of course, like any other physiological process, put in the headmistress professionally. 8 o'clock at the Savoy. It was all arranged. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. "Do you mind waiting here for a moment while I go and telephone?" asked Bernard. The savage waited and watched. The main day shift was just going off duty. Crowds of lower caste workers were queued up in front of the monorail station. 700 or 800 Gamma, Delta and Epsilon men and women, with not more than a dozen faces and statues between them. To each of them, with his or her ticket, the booking clerk pushed over a little cardboard pillbox. The long caterpillar of men and women moved slowly forward. "What's in those?" remembering the Merchant of Venice. "Those caskets?" the savage inquired when Bernard had rejoined him. "The day's soma ration," Bernard answered rather indistinctly, for he was masticating a piece of Benito Hoover's chewing gum. "They get it after their work's over. 4 half-gram tablets, 6 on Saturday." He took John's arm affectionately and they walked towards the helicopter. Lenina came singing into the changing room. "You seem very pleased with yourself," said Fanny. "I am pleased," she answered. "Zip! Bernard rang up half an hour ago. Zip, zip!" She stepped out of her shorts. "He has an unexpected engagement. Zip! Asked me if I'd take the savage to the Feelies this evening. I must fly." She hurried away towards the bathroom. "She is a lucky girl," Fanny said to herself, as she watched Lenina go. There was no envy in the comment. Good-natured Fanny was merely stating a fact. Lenina was lucky. Lucky in having shared with Bernard a generous portion of the savage's immense celebrity. Lucky in reflecting from her insignificant person the moment's supremely fashionable glory. Had not the secretary of the Young Women for the Association asked her to give a lecture about her experiences? Had she not been invited to the annual dinner of the Aphrodisium Club? Had she not already appeared in the Feelytone News? Visibly, audibly, and tactually appeared to countless millions all over the planet. Hardly less flattering had been the attentions paid her by conspicuous individuals. The resident World Controller's secondary secretary had asked her to dine and break breakfast. She had spent one weekend with the 4th Chief Justice, and another with the arch-community songster of Canterbury. The president of the Internal and External Secretions Corporation was perpetually on the phone, and she had been to Deaville with the deputy governor of the Bank of Europe. "It's wonderful, of course, and yet in a way," she had confessed to Fanny, "I feel as though I were getting something on false pretenses, because, of course, the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage, and I have to say, I don't know." She shook her head. "Most of the men don't believe me, of course, but it's true. I wish it weren't," she added sadly and sighed. "But terribly good-looking, don't you think so? He's terribly good-looking, don't you think so?" "But doesn't he like you?" asked Fanny. "Sometimes I think he does, and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me. Goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometimes if I turn around suddenly, I catch him staring, and then, well, you know how men look when they like you." Yes, Fanny knew. "I can't make it out," said Lenina. She couldn't make it out, and Anoli was bewildered. was also rather upset, because you see, Fanny, I, like him, liked him more and more. Well, now there'll be a real chance, she thought, as she scented herself after her bath. Dab, 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 a real chance. Her high spirits overflowed in song. Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snuggly bunny. Love as good as Soma. The sand organ was playing a delightfully refreshing herbal capriccio, rippling arpeggios of thyme and lavender, of rosemary, basil, myrtle, tarragon, a series of daring modulations through the spice keys into ambergris, and the slow return through sandalwood, camphor, cedar, and new-mown hay, with occasional subtle touches of discord, a whiff of kidney pudding, and the faintest suspicion of pig's dung. Back to the simple aromatics with which the piece began. The final blast of time died away. There was a round of applause. The lights went up. In the synthetic music machine, the soundtrack roll began to unwind. It was a trio for hyper-violin, supercello, and oboe surrogate that now filled the air with its agreeable languor. Thousands, 30 or 40 bars, and then again this instrumental black background. A much more than human voice began to warble, now throaty, now from the head, now hollow as a flute, now charged with yearning harmonics. It effortlessly passed from Graspart's, Forster's low record on the very frontiers of musical tone, to a trilled bad note high above the highest C to which, in 1770, at the Ducal Opera of Parma, and to the astonishment of Mozart, Lucrezia Aggiurgi, alone of all the singers in history, once piercingly gave utterance. Sunk in their pneumatic stalls, Lenina and the savage sniffed and listened. It was now the turn also for eyes and skin. The house lights went down. Fiery letters stood out solid and as though self-supported in the darkness. 3 weeks in a helicopter. An all super singing, super synthetic talking, colored, stereoscopic feely, with synchronized scent organ accompaniment. Take hold of those metal knobs on the arms of your chair, whispered Lenina, otherwise you won't get any of the feely effects. The savage did as he was told. Those fiery letters, meanwhile, had disappeared. There were 10 seconds of complete darkness. Then suddenly, dazzling and incomparably more solid-looking than they would have seemed in actual flesh and blood, far more real than reality, there stood the stereoscopic images, locked in one another's arms, a gigantic Negro and a golden-haired young brachiocephalic beta plus female. The savage started. That sensation on his lips. He lifted a hand to his mouth. The titillation ceased. Let his hand fall back on the metal knob. It began again. The scent organ, meanwhile, breathed pure musk. Expiringly, a soundtrack super dove cooed, ooh, ooh, and a vibrating only 32 times a second. A deeper than African bass made answer. Ah, ooh, ooh. The stereoscopic lips came together again, and once more the facial erogenous zones of the 6,000 spectators in the Alhambra tingled with almost intolerable galvanic pleasure. Ooh! The plot of the film was extremely simple. A few minutes after the first oohs and ahs, a duet having been sung and a little love made on that famous bearskin, every hair of which the assistant predestinator was perfectly right, could be separately and distinctly felt. The Negro had a helicopter accident, fell on his head, thump. What a twinge through the forehead! A chorus of ahs and eyes went up from the audience. The concussion knocked all the Negro's conditioning into a cocked hat. He developed for the beta blonde an exclusive and maniacal passion. She protested. He persisted. There was struggles, pursuits, an assault on a rival, finally a sensational kidnapping. The beat-up blonde was ravished away into the sky and kept there, hovering for 3 weeks in a wildly antisocial tete-a-tete with the black madman. Finally, after a whole series of adventures and much aerial acrobacy, 3 handsome young alphas succeeded in rescuing her. The Negro was packed off to an adult reconditioning center, and the film ended happily and decorously, with the beat-up blonde becoming the mistress of all her 3 rescuers. They interrupted themselves for a moment to sing a synthetic quartet with full super orchestral accompaniment, and the gardenias on the scent organ. Then the bearskin made a final appearance, and amid a blare of saxophones, the last stereoscopic kiss faded into blackness. The last electrical titillation died on the lips like a dying moth that quivers ever more feebly, ever more faintly, and at last is quiet, quite still. But for Lenina the moth did not completely die. Even after the lights had gone up, while they were shuffling slowly along with the crowd towards the lifts, its ghost still fluttered against her lips, still traced fine shuddering roads of anxiety and pleasure across her skin. Her cheeks were flushed. She caught hold of the savage's arms and pressed it, limp, against her side. He looked down at her for a moment, pale, pained, desiring, and ashamed of his desire. He was not worthy, not. Their eyes for a moment met. What treasures hers possessed! A queen's ransom of temperament. Hastily he looked away, disengaged his imprisoned arm. He was obscurely terrified lest she should cease to be something he could feel himself unworthy of. "I don't think you ought to see things like that," he said, making haste to transfer from Lenina herself to the surrounding circumstances the blame for any past or possible future lapse from perfection. "Things like what, John? Like this horrible film." "Horrible?" Lenina was genuinely astonished. "But I thought it was lovely." "It was base," he said indignantly. "It was ignoble." She shook her head. "I don't know what you mean. Why was he so queer? Why did he go out of his way to spoil things? In the taxi copter he hardly even looked at her, bound by strong vows that he had never been pronounced, obedient to laws that had long since ceased to run. He sat averted and in silence. Sometimes, as though a finger had plucked at some taut, almost breaking string, his whole body would shake with a sudden nervous start. The taxicopter landed on the roof of Lenina's apartment's house. At last, she thought exultantly as she stepped out of the cab. At last, even though he had been so queer just now, standing under a lamp, she peered into her hand mirror. At last. Her nose was a bit shiny. She shook the loose powder from her puff while he was paying off the taxi. There would just be time. She rubbed at the shininess, thinking, he's terribly good looking. No need for him to be shy like Bernard, and yet, any other man would have done it long ago. Well, now at last. That fragment of her face in the little round mirror suddenly smiled at her. "Good night," said a strangled voice behind her. Lenina wheeled round. He was standing in the doorway of the cab, his eyes fixed, staring, had evidently been staring all this time while she was powdering her nose, waiting. But what for? Or hesitating, trying to make up his mind, and all the time thinking. She could not imagine what extraordinary thoughts. "Good night, Lenina," he repeated, and made a strange grimacing attempt to smile. "But, John, I thought you were... aren't you..." He shut the door and bent forward to say something to the driver. The cab shot up into the air. Looking down through the window in the floor, the savage could see Lenina's upturned face, pale in the bluish light of the lamps. The mouth was open. She was calling. Her foreshortened figure rushed away from him. The diminishing square of the roof seemed to be falling through the darkness. 5 minutes later he was back in his room. From its hiding place, he took out his mouse-nibbled volume, turned with religious care its stained and crumpled pages, and began to read Othello. Othello, he remembered, was like the hero of 3 Weeks in a Helicopter, a black man. Drying her eyes, Lenina walked across the roof to the lift. On her way down to the 27th floor, she pulled out her Soma bottle. 1 gram, she decided, would not be enough. Hers had been more than 1 gram affliction. But if she took 2 grams, she ran the risk of not waking up in time tomorrow morning. She compromised, and into her cupped left palm shook out 3 half-gram tablets. Okay, chapter 12 coming up. I'm gonna take a sip of water here. There will be 2 more episodes after this, by the way. It goes till chapter 18. So next one will be 13, 14, and 15. And after that will follow 16, 17, and 18. I might take a break during the reading as well to take another sip of water. But in any case, let's continue with chapter 12. Bernard had to shout through the locked door. The savage would not open. But everybody's there, waiting for you. Let them wait, came back the muffled voice through the door. But you know quite well, John, how difficult it is to sound persuasive at the top of one's voice. I asked them on purpose to meet you. You ought to have asked me first whether I wanted to meet them. But you always came before, John. That's precisely why I don't want to come again. Just to please me, Bernard bellowingly wheedled. Won't you come to please me? No. Do you seriously mean it? Yes. Despairingly. But what shall I do? Bernard wailed. Go to hell, bawled the exasperated voice from within. But the arch-community songster of Canterbury is there tonight. Bernard was almost in tears. Aya takwa. It was only in Zuni that the savage could adequately express what he felt about the arch-community songster. Hani, he added as an afterthought, and then, with what the rise of the ferocity, Sans esotsena, and he spat on the ground, as Pope might have done. In the end, Bernard had to slink back, diminished, to his rooms, and inform the impatient assembly that the savage would not be appearing that evening. The news was received with indignation. The men were furious at having been tricked into behaving politely to this insignificant fellow with the unsavory reputation and heretical opinions. The higher their position in the hierarchy, the deeper their resentment. To play such a joke on me, the arch-songster kept repeating, on me. As for the women, they indignantly felt that they had been had on false pretenses. Had by a wretched little man who had had alcohol poured into his bottle by mistake, by a creature with a gamma-minus physique. It was an outrage, and they said so, more and more loudly. The headmistress of Eton was particularly scathing. Lenina alone said nothing. Pale, her blue eyes clouded with an unwanted melancholy. She sat in a corner, cut off from those who surrounded her by an emotion which they did not share. She had come to the party filled with a strange feeling of anxious exultation. In a few minutes, she had said to herself, as she entered the room, I shall be seeing him, talking to him, telling him, for she had come with her mind made up, that I like him, more than anybody I've ever known, and perhaps then he'll say... What would he say? The blood had rushed to her cheeks. Why was he so strange the other night after the Feelies? So queer. And yet I'm absolutely sure he really does rather like me, I'm sure. It was at this moment that Bernard had made his announcement. The savage wasn't coming to the party. Lenina suddenly felt all the sensations normally experienced at the beginning of a violent passion surrogate treatment. A sense of dreadful emptiness, a breathless apprehension, a nausea. Her heart seemed to stop beating. Perhaps it's because he doesn't like me, she said to herself, and at once this possibility became an established certainty. John had refused to come because he didn't like her. He didn't like her. It really is a bit too thick, the headmistress of Even was saying to the director of crematoria and phosphorus reclamation. When I think that I actually... Yes, came the voice of Fanny Crone. It's absolutely true about the alcohol. Someone I knew someone who was working in the embryo store at the time. She said to my friend, and my friend said to me, too bad, said Henry Foster, sympathizing with the arch-community songster. It may interest you to know that our ex-director was on the point of transferring him to Iceland. Pierced by every word that was spoken, the tight balloon of Bernard's happy self-confidence was leaking from 1,000 wounds. Pale, distraught, abject, and agitated, he moved among his guests, stammering incoherent apologies, assuring them the next time the savage would certainly be there, begging them to sit down and take a carotene sandwich, a slice of vitamin A pâté, a glass of champagne surrogate. They duly ate, but ignored him, drank, and were either rude to his face or talked to one another about him, loudly and offensively, as though he had not been there. And now, my friends, said the arch-community songster of Canterbury, in that beautiful ringing voice with which he led the proceedings at Ford's Day celebrations, now, my friends, I think perhaps the time has come. He rose, put down his glass, brushed from his purple viscose waistcoat the crumbs of considerable collation, and walked towards the door. Bernard darted forward to intercept him. Must you really, arch-songster? It's very early still. I'd hoped you would. Yeah. What hadn't he hoped when Lenina confidently told him that the arch-community songster would accept an invitation if it were sent? He's really rather sweet, you know. And she had shown Bernard the little golden zipper fastening in the form of a T, which the arch-songster had given her as a memento of the week-end she had spent at Lambeth, to meet the arch-community songster of Canterbury and Miss the Savage. Bernard had proclaimed his triumph on every invitation card, but the Savage had chosen this evening of all evenings to lock himself up in his room, to shout Hani, and even it was lucky that Bernard didn't understand Zuni, sans esocena. What should have been the crowning moment of Bernard's whole career had turned out to be the moment of his greatest humiliation. I'd so much hoped, he stammeringly repeated, looking up at the great dignitary with pleading and distracted eyes. My young friend, said the arch-community songster, in a tone of loud and solemn severity. There was a general silence. Let me give you a word of advice. He wagged his finger at Bernard. Before it's too late, a word of good advice. His voice became sepulchral. Mend your ways, my young friend, mend your ways. He made the sign of the T over him and turned away. Lenina, my dear, he called in another tone, come with me. Obediently, but unsmiling, and wholly insensible of the honor done to her, without elation, Lenina walked after him, out of the room. The other guests followed at a respected interval. The last of them slammed the door. Bernard was all alone. Punctured, utterly deflated, he dropped into a chair, and, covering his face with his hands, began to weep. A few minutes later, however, he thought better of it, and took 4 tablets of soma. Upstairs in his room the Savage was reading Romeo and Juliet. Lenina and the arch-community songster stepped out on the roof of Lambeth Palace. Hurry up, my young friend, I mean, Lenina, called the arch-songster impatiently from the lift gates. Lenina, who had lingered for a moment to look at the moon, dropped her eyes and came hurrying across the roof to rejoin him. A New Theory of Biology was the title of the paper which Mustafa Month had just finished reading. He sat for some time, meditatively frowning, then picked up his pen and wrote across the title page, "The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel and highly ingenious, but heretical, and so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive. Not to be published." He underlined the words, "The author will be kept under supervision. His transference to the Marine Biological Station of St. Helena may become necessary." A pity, he thought, as he signed his name. It was a masterly piece of work, but once you began admitting explanations in terms of purpose, well, you didn't know what the results might be. It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled minds among the higher castes, make them lose their faith in happiness as the sovereign good, and take to believing, instead, that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere, that the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge, which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not in the present circumstances, admissible. He picked up his pen again, and under the words "not to be published" drew a second line, thicker and blacker than the first, then sighed. What fun it would be, he thought, if one didn't have to think about happiness. With closed eyes, his face shining with rapture, John was softly declaiming to vacancy, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear." The golden tea lay shining on Lenina's bosom, sportively. The arch community songster caught hold of it. Sportively he pulled. "Pulled, I think," said Lenina suddenly, breaking a long silence. "I'd better take a couple grams of soma." Bernard, by this time, was fast asleep and smiling at the private paradise of his dreams. Smiling, but inexorably, after every 30 seconds, the minute hand of the electric clock above his head jumped forward with an almost imperceptible click. Click, 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 and it was morning. Bernard was back amongst the miseries of space and time. It was in the lowest spirits that he taxied across to his work at the conditioning center. The intoxication of success had evaporated. He was so soberly his old self, and by contrast with the temporary balloon of these last weeks, the old self seemed unprecedentedly heavier than the surrounding atmosphere. To this deflated Bernard the savage showed himself unexpectedly sympathetic. "You're more like what you were at Malface," he said, when Bernard had told him his plaintive story. "Do you remember when we first talked together, outside the little house? You're like what you were then. Because I'm unhappy again, that's why. Well, I'd rather be unhappy than have the sort of false, lying happiness you were having here." "I like that," said Bernard bitterly, "when it's you who were the cause of it all, refusing to come to my party, and so turning them all against me." He knew that what he was saying was absurd in its injustice. He admitted inwardly, and at last even aloud, the truth of all the savage moment. The truth of all that the savage now said about the worthlessness of friends who could be turned upon so slight a provocation into persecuting enemies. But in spite of this knowledge and these admissions, in spite of the fact that his friend's support and sympathy were now his only comfort, Bernard continued perversely to nourish, along with his quiet, genuine affection, a secret grievance against the savage, to mediate a campaign of small revenges to be wreaked upon him. Nourishing a grievance against the arch-community songster was useless. There was no possibility of being revenged on the chief butler or the assistant predestinator. As a victim, the savage possessed, for Bernard, this enormous superiority over the others, that he was accessible. One of the principal functions of a friend is to suffer, in a milder and symbolic form, the punishments that we should like, but are unable to inflict upon our enemies. Bernard's other victim friend was Helmholtz. When discomfited, he came and asked once more for the friendship which, in his prosperity, he had not thought it worth his while to preserve. Helmholtz gave it, and gave it without a reproach, without a comment, as though he had forgotten that there had ever been a quarrel. Touched, Bernard felt himself at the same time humiliated by this magnanimity. Magnanimity, the more extraordinary and therefore the more humiliating in that it owed nothing to Soma, and everything to Helmholtz's character. It was the Helmholtz of daily life who forgot and forgave, not the Helmholtz of a half-gram holiday. Bernard was duly grateful. It was an enormous comfort to have his friend again, and also duly resentful. It would be pleasure to take some revenge on Helmholtz for his generosity. At their first meeting after the estrangement, Bernard poured out the tale of his miseries and the accepted consolation. It was not till some days later that he learned, to his surprise and with a twinge of shame, that he was not the only one who had been in trouble. Helmholtz had also come into conflict with authority. It was over some rhymes, he explained. I was given my usual course of advanced emotional engineering for third-year students, 12 lectures, of which the seventh is about rhymes, on the use of rhymes in moral propaganda and advertisement. To be precise, I always illustrate my lecture with a lot of technical examples. This time I thought I'd give them one I'd written myself. Pure madness, of course, but I couldn't resist. He laughed. I was curious to see what their reaction would be besides. He added more gravely, I wanted to do a bit of propaganda. I was trying to engineer them into feeling as I'd felt when I wrote the rhymes. Thought, he laughed. What an outcry there was. The principal had me up and threatened to hand me the immediate sack. I'm a marked man. But what were your rhymes? Bernard asked. They were about being alone. Bernard's eyebrows went up. I'll recite them to you if you like. And Bernard and Helmholtz began. Yesterday's committee, sticks but a broken drum, midnight in the city, flutes in a vacuum, shut lips, sleeping faces, every stopped machine, the dumb and littered places where crowds have been. All silence rejoice, weep loudly or low, speak but with the voice of whom I do not know. Absence, say, of Susans, absence of Egerias, arms and respective bosoms, lips and posteriors, slowly form a presence. Woos and I ask, of what, so absurd an essence, that something which is not, nevertheless should populate empty night more solidly than that which we copulate, with which we copulate. Why should it seem so squalidly? When I gave them that as an example, and they reported me to the principal. I'm not surprised, said Bernard. It's flatly against all their sleep teaching. Remember, they've had at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. I know, but I thought I'd like to see what the effects would be. Well, you've seen now. Helmholtz only laughed. I feel, he said, after a silence, as though I were just beginning to have something to write about. As though I were beginning to be able to use that power I feel I've got inside of me. That extra, latent power. Something seems to be coming to me. In spite of all his troubles, he seemed, Bernard thought, profoundly happy. Helmholtz and the savage took to one another at once, so cordially indeed that Bernard felt a sharp pang of jealousy. In all these weeks he had never come so close to an intimacy with the savage as Helmholtz immediately achieved. Watching them, listening to their talk, he found himself sometimes resentfully wishing that he had never brought them together. He was ashamed of his jealousy, and alternatively made efforts of will and took Soma to keep himself from feeling it. But the efforts were not very successful, and between the Soma holidays there were, of necessity, intervals. The odious sentiment kept on returning. At his third meeting with the savage, Helmholtz recited his rhymes on solitude. "What do you think of them?" he asked when he was done. The savage shook his head. "Listen to this," was his answer, and, unlocking the drawer in which he kept his mouse-eaten book, he opened and read, "Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald said, and trumpet be." Helmholtz listened with a growing excitement. At sole Arabian tree he started, at "Thou shrieking harbinger." He smiled with a sudden pleasure. At every fowl of tyrant wing, the blood rushed up into his cheeks, but at the defunctive music, he turned pale and trembled with an unprecedented emotion. The savage read on. "Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same, single nature's double name, neither two nor one was called." Reason in itself confound saw the vision grow together. "Orgy porgy," said Bernard, interrupting the reading with a loud and pleasant laugh. "It's just a solidarity service hymn." He was revenging himself on his two friends for liking one another more than they liked him. In the course of their next 2 or 3 meetings he frequently repeated his little act of vengeance. It was simple, and since both Helmholtz and the savage were dreadfully pained by the shattering and defilement of a favorite poetic crystal, extremely effective. In the end, Helmholtz dreaded to kick him out of the room if he dared to interrupt again, and yet, strangely enough, the next interruption, the most disgraceful of all, came from Helmholtz himself. The savage was reading Romeo and Juliet aloud, reading, for all the time he was seeing himself as Romeo and Lenina as Juliet, with an intense and quivering passion. Helmholtz had listened to the scene of the lovers' first meeting with a puzzled interest. The scene in the orchard had delighted him with its poetry, but the sentiments expressed had made him smile. Getting into such a state about having a girl. It seemed rather ridiculous, but, taken detail by verbal detail, what a superb piece of emotional engineering. "That old fellow," he said, "he makes our best propaganda technicians look absolutely silly." The savage smiled triumphantly and resumed his reading. All went tolerably well until, in the last scene of the third act, Capulet and Lady Capulet began to bully Juliet to marry Paris. Helmholtz had been restless throughout the entire scene, but when, pathetically mimed by the savage, Juliet cried out, "Is there no pity sitting in the clouds, that sees into the bottom of my grief? O sweet my mother, cast me not away. Delay this marriage for a month, a week, or if you do not, make the bridal bed in that dim monument where Tybalt lies." Where Juliet said this, Helmholtz broke out in an explosion of uncontrolled guffawing. The mother and father, grotesque obscenity forcing the daughter to have someone she didn't want, and the idiotic girl not saying that she was having someone else whom, for the moment at any rate, she preferred. In its smutty absurdity, the situation was irresistibly comical. He had managed, with an heroic effort, to hold down the mounting pressure of his hilarity, but sweet mother, in the savage's tremulous tone of anguish, and the reference to Tybalt lying dead, but evidently uncremated, and wasting his phosphorus on a dim monument, were too much for him. He laughed and laughed till the tears streamed down his face, quenchlessly laughed while pale with a sense of outrage, The savage looked at him over the top of his book, and then, as the laughter still continued, closed it indignantly, got up, and, with the gesture of one who removes his pearl from before swine, locked it away in his drawer. And yet, said Helmholtz, when having recovered breath enough to apologize, he had mollified the savage into listening to his explanations. I know quite well that one needs ridiculous, mad situations like that. One can't write really well about anything else. Why was that old fellow such a marvelous propaganda technician? Because he had so many insane, excruciating things to get excited about. You've got to be hurt and upset, otherwise you can't think of the really good, penetrating, X-rayish phrases. But father and mother, he shook his head. You can't expect me to keep a straight face about fathers and mothers. And who's going to get excited about a boy having a girl or not having her? The savage winced, but Helmholtz, who was staring pensively at the floor, saw nothing. No, he concluded with a sigh, it won't do. We need some other kind of madness and violence. But what? What? Where can one find it? He was silent, then, shaking his head, I don't know, he said at last. I don't know. That was chapter 12. I hope you all enjoyed today's reading. And I will see you guys next time. All 0 of you who are currently listening to this. If you listen to this in the future, I hope you have a nice day. And I will see you guys later. Bye bye.